welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I am sharing my final wrap up for March with you. I ended up completing 18 books, and then I had 2 DNFs. A bunch of those, I think 11 of the ones that I finished and one of my DNFs are all addressed in my mid-March wrap up. So I'm going to go ahead and link that here because I'm not going to talk about those books at all in this video. I'm just going to talk about the ones that I finished the second half of the month, the one that I DNF'd, and then I also have a couple of books that I didn't finish that are carrying over into April. Let's start with my DNF and just get that out of the way. So I am sadly DNFing Gone with the Winds. I do not know if this is a permanent DNF, to be fair. I have gotten halfway through it, and I just had a lot of other reading commitments and buddy reads that were going on, and I was going to be reading this with some people, and then both of them just, I think, ended up not having time to get to this book. So I was like halfway through the book and not really enjoying it, to be honest. I really love Margaret Mitchell's writing. So we'll get the good thing out of the way first. Her writing is so vivid and it really feels like you're there, and she is a really good storyteller. And I really enjoyed that aspect of this book, and I wish that she had written more than Gone with the Wind because I would be interested to pick up other books that she has written. But I also had a lot of issues with this book. I have to say that as much as I kept coming back to it because I was really enjoying the writing, I really hated all of the characters except one. Like, all the other characters are absolutely atrocious, selfish, terrible people. And bad things are happening, and this is taking place in the South, and it begins as rumors of the Civil War are starting. And then at the part of the book where I ended up DNFing, we have gotten through the Civil War and they're kind of dealing with some of the Reconstruction stuff. And I don't think that any of that is even remotely spoilery because I think I was the only one that didn't know that this book actually spanned over the Civil War. I was not aware of that. So that's probably not spoilery for anyone, and it's not spoilery to the plot. But you're watching these people go through these hardships as they're living in these areas of war and things are happening. And I found it really hard to root for the main character or feel sorry for her at all because she was just terrible. And I ended up talking to quite a few people about their experiences reading this book with people who loved it or appreciated it for what it was. And I had some people say things like, well, you know, I think that it really just showed how the war really made Scarlett just use people for her own survival. And I was like, okay, but she was using people before. The whole book, she's using and manipulating people around her. Did she need to at the beginning? No, but that's just who she is. So it's just further bringing out who she really is as a person. And then someone else said to me, that's the beauty of Margaret Mitchell's writing, is that she can take this really dislikable protagonist and somehow make you root for her anyway. And I wasn't rooting for Scarlett. I'm like, someone needs to take this girl down like 20 pegs because apparently a war doesn't even do that for her. So there's a lot. And of course, you know, I did go into this realizing that there was going to be very heavy racist content, and I knew that, and I still was just surprised at the level of just romanticizing the antebellum South, romanticizing slavery with all these happy slaves who think that they are just better because they're owned by rich people. They're like, oh, well, we're better than those slaves over there, or we're better than that white trash who doesn't even have enough money to own any slaves. And it was odd to read a book that was like that. However, I am saying that I'm not sure this is a permanent DNF because I did really enjoy Margaret Mitchell's writing and her storytelling as a whole. So it may be one that I go back to at some point. In fact, I was thinking on pushing it to April, but then I had all these other books I was going to read in April that I would rather read, to be totally honest. And I know that this book is apparently inspired a bit by Vanity Fair, and I didn't love Vanity Fair. I thought the humor in it was good, but I thought it dragged on for way too long. And then I had someone tell me, well, did you know Gone with the Wind is actually based on Vanity Fair with better character development and better writing. And so when I started reading it, I was like, okay, yeah, I think that the character development might be better, but it's longer than Vanity Fair by hundreds of pages. So it still gets the feeling to me of just, it feels like a lot. So I just decided that I'm done for right now. I may pick it up again at some point. I can see why it's considered a classic, but I don't know. I think I was just really done with Scarlet and Red. The next 3 books that I read in the month of March were all part of my project to read all the Newberry nominees this year. And I do have a reading vlog on that. So I'll link that because I'm not going to share my in-depth thoughts here because I really shared my in-depth thoughts there. It's like a 45-minute video of me reading 4 books, but I was really just like looking at these books and really digging deep into them, because when books are nominated for the Newberry, you get the impression that these are what is considered the best books that middle grade had to offer in that year. So I read all 4 books, one of which I actually talked about in my mid-month wrap-up. That's Maisie Chen's Last Chance. Next one that I read was The Last Mapmaker, which is a fantasy story that has a very intricate like class system, which is really interesting. That's not something I see all that often in middle grade fantasies, but it's very common in YA and adult fantasies. And I am a sucker for class systems in a fantasy. So it already had that going for it. I felt like the writing was wonderful. Just wonderful. I feel like a lot of the new releases I have read for middle grade feels very like bare bones writing and just very straightforward prose, which is fine. But this one I just felt was written more beautifully, and I really enjoyed that. It didn't feel flowery at all, not even a little, but it just felt really well written. It has a lot of adventure because our main protagonist is a girl who is the daughter of a convict, and she has kind of manipulated and lied her way into becoming an assistant to a map maker. Then the queen sends out kind of this proclamation for people who would like to go out and map uncharted seas that no one has yet mapped. So Sai, the main character, and her map maker that she is the assistant to end up going on this voyage on a ship. And so it's super adventurous. I really, really enjoyed this one. I also listened to the audio of Evilise Explains It All, which is another Newberry nominee. And this one I had super mixed feelings on. Again, I don't want to get into super long details because I really, this was the book I talked about the most, I think, in that reading vlog, because I had a lot of problems with it. It is a free verse novel about a young girl, Evilise, who is in a school. She's starting 7th grade, and her grandmother, who has beginning stages of dementia, is coming to live with them. And she also has anxiety and PTSD, but we don't find out until about halfway what has caused this PTSD. And it was difficult to read. It's a free verse novel, and she's writing this poetry in her journal, but it felt more like journal entries than poetry. Didn't feel as poetic as a lot of free verse novels I have read. And the way that it deals with mental illness, I can see a lot of people saying this is an important book for middle grade, but the intensity of it felt like too much for middle grade. It felt much more like a YA book, both in terms of the character's voice being like very, very angsty, but also just, I don't know, the way that it addressed some of the mental illness things. There's a lot. And I would say that there is trigger warning for self-harm and suicidal ideation, which feels like a lot when you consider the younger end of middle grade. It starts at 3rd grade. And that is like really, really young to be handing something to a kid that has such detailed discussions of some of those things. So that one I had really mixed feelings on. Then I read the Newberry winner, Free Water. And this one deals with this young boy and his sister who escape from slavery off their plantation, and they end up in the swamp, and they are assisted by another ex-slave who brings them into this community in this swamp of slaves who have escaped, and some of them have stayed there and had families, and there are children who have been born in this community who have never seen a plantation, never seen a white man, never left this community. community. And so it's interesting because it's not an area of history that is talked about all that much, which kind of makes sense because in the author's note, the author actually tells us that there is so much that we don't know. We have some evidence of this, but we really don't know how they lived. We don't know if they lived in communities at all or if it was just individual families. There's a lot that we really don't know. So a lot of it was very imaginative on the part of the author rather than factual, because there's not a lot of detail known. So almost the entirety of the book was very speculative in that way. And also there is a lot of viewpoints in this book, like a lot. I went back and was just thinking in my brain of how many viewpoints, and there's at least 8, and I may be missing some. And to me, that made the book feel less like I could connect to the characters because I was bopping around so much from person to person. And I didn't like all the characters either. So there's that. Moving on to the last middle grade that I completed in the month of March, and that is The Tiger Rising by Kate DiCamillo. This apparently was a National Book Award finalist, and this is an older one of Kate DiCamillo's books, not one that I had really heard anyone talk about until I put it on my Reader Rid project, because it's been sitting on my shelf for literally like 6-7 years and I haven't gotten to it. And then I had just a couple of people kind of come out of the woodwork and be like, I'll be interested to hear what you think of that, because it's definitely not my favorite of hers. And anyone that I talked to about it actually really hated it beforehand. So I went into it with really, really low expectations. It's about this young boy whose mother has passed away, and he is living in this motel with his dad. His dad is working for the motel, and it's just kind of chronicles him like going to school, and he's getting bullied really badly, and he meets this girl who is new to town and she is also being bullied, and it just kind of follows their friendship and also this tiger that they find in a cage in the woods. I love Kate DiCamillo's writing, and I actually really enjoyed her writing in this overall. Just the way that she writes is just lovely. I love it so much, but I did not like this book at all. And I don't think it was because I was influenced by people who were telling me they didn't like it, because I think that I wouldn't have loved it anyway. Like, it deals with grief, but first of all, this book is so short with really big print, and I think it's like, yeah, it's just barely over 100 pages, 114 pages, and it doesn't give us really much of an opportunity to really get to know the characters at all, and that made it difficult. There are so many questions that are not answered that seem to be like they're integral to something that's going on, and then it never gets answered. There's this message of like not repressing your feelings and letting them rise up, and that kind of ties in with the imagery of the tiger in this book. But then the way that it ends, it just not only was it very abrupt, but it seemed to kind of counteract some of the messaging that was happening in the first part of the book. It was just an odd book. I don't know. I don't even know what to tell you about it, because it's just odd. It's a really strange book. And so, I don't know, it just felt like, let's just take this book, and it's supposed to be for kids, but let's pack it full of so much symbolism and make it so it tugs at your heartstrings without any like actual real resolution or things that make sense or any of that kind of stuff. We're just gonna be emotional for the sake of being emotional, and it just like, I don't know, really rubbed me the wrong way, a lot of it. And I didn't really like most of the characters in this book. Like the little girl, she just seems like very angry for good reason, but she comes off as more bratty than a child that's actually hurting. I didn't like the kid's father. The kid himself, I felt like a very bland protagonist. Like his only personality trait is that he hides how he feels. And that feels like that's all there is to him. And again, it's because it's such a short book. Like, I feel like this could have been a better book if it had been longer and we'd spent more time with the characters, and if the resolution of the ending had been different. Okay, so the last two books that I finished are not middle grade books. One of them is a Christian nonfiction. That's C.S. Lewis's Reflections on the Psalms. And I have been reading through the Psalms in my Bible since the beginning of the year, just kind of slowly making my way through them, reading about a psalm a day. And that has just been really awesome to just kind of dig deeper into the Psalms. So when I realized that C.S. Lewis had a book where he talked about his thoughts on the Psalms, I was like, I have to read this. And so I started reading it, and I didn't love it, unfortunately. I wish that I had. There were elements to it that were good. There were some really good quotes and nuggets of truth that were buried in here. But overall, I feel like I didn't agree with a lot of his interpretations and findings in this book. I agreed with some, obviously, but I really appreciated the way that he wrote his feelings and his findings about the Psalms, especially the ones that I disagreed with. I love the way that he wrote them because, first of all, I feel like it helped me look at some of the Psalms in a different light and still made me think deeply about them. But also he makes it really clear, like, hey, I'm not an expert theologian. So these are my thoughts. These are my findings. This is what I think and how I interpret maybe some of these parts that are a little bit more difficult to interpret or maybe controversial at times. And so I just really appreciated the way that he talked about it because it didn't make it seem like here's the end all be all, like a lot of Christian nonfiction can be. There was a lot of humility in his writing, and I really appreciated that, especially as I didn't agree with everything that he said. I didn't feel like he was like, well, if you don't agree with me, then you're a heretic, goodbye. You know, so I just love C.S. Lewis's writing in general. I still feel like it was worth it to read, even if it wasn't quite the experience that maybe I was hoping it would be. And the last book that I finished in the month of March is my favorite book by far, and I kind of knew it was gonna be. We actually had a live on my Patreon to discuss our favorite books in March, but we did it like 2 days before March was over, so I hadn't finished this book yet. So I told them, I was like, I think this is gonna be my favorite, but it felt disingenuous to say that it is because I haven't finished it yet. And that is Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. Assassin's Apprentice is the first book in this trilogy in which we follow Fitz, which is a young man who is living in this castle. He is actually the bastard son of a prince, and he ends up being trained to be an assassin. That's not really a spoiler because it's in the title of this book and the last book. So there's a lot of political intrigue and a lot of different things that are happening, which I really loved. There's several different magic systems, which is really, really interesting as well. But my biggest thing is that I love Robin Hobb's writing. This is only my second book by her that I've read, and I just adore the way that she writes. Like from page 1 of the first book, I was just like, oh my gosh, I love this. And then getting back into this one, I was like, oh, I needed Robin Hobb in my life. I needed a Robin Hobb book so bad, and I didn't even know. So I read Assassin's Apprentice, the first book, in November of last year, and it became my favorite book of the entire year. Like it upended all my predictions. And then I read Royal Assassin and was just like, oh my gosh, like I just inhaled this book the last week of March. Every waking moment, all I wanted to do was read more of this book. And I was just like, oh my gosh, can I just ditch every responsibility and just read this book? And I was like, wow, the last time I felt this way about a book and that I was this immersed in a book was when I read Assassin's Apprentice in November. So amazing. Loved it so much. There's some beautiful quotes in here as well that I actually shared on my Instagram, so you may have seen those. I just love her character development. I love her writing. I love her world. I love everything about it. I do feel like this book ups the ante a bit from Assassin's Apprentice in terms of some of the fighting, some of the violence, and some of the other things, because in the first book we start with Fitz when he's pretty young. I think he's either 6 or 8 when we meet him at the beginning of the first book, and in this book, you know, he's coming into adulthood, and so you've got his first like real relationship with someone and like all this kind of stuff, and so there's definitely increased content with that, but I didn't ever feel like it was gratuitous or over the top or anything like that. I just loved it. I thought it was great. I don't even know what else to say to you. I'm filming this on April 1st, so I just finished this yesterday and already want to pick up the next book. But if you've seen my April TBR, you know that I have some big books on there. So unfortunately, the next book in this trilogy cannot be the next book that I pick up, but this continues. This is the first trilogy of many in her Realm of the Elderlings, Realm of the Elderlings series. This is the first trilogy in that, and then there are subsequent trilogies and the stories all intertwine. So this is really just the beginning of the beginning, and I want to read book 3 so bad, but I'm gonna have to wait till May at least, unfortunately. So that's okay. We're just gonna bask in how much we loved this book and not think about how we have to wait for book 3. We'll think about how I'm savoring this and make it a positive thing. So I was hoping by the end of the month that I would have finished Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. I did not. I have not. I am still working on that, and I'm also still working on Middlemarch by George Eliot, which was in my April TBR. I fully anticipated not finishing that one. That was never the plan, to finish it in March, so that's totally fine. So those are the 2 books that I'm carrying over, but these are the last of the books that I finished in March. Overall, I think that I had a pretty mediocre reading month in March. Unfortunately, I think I only had like 3 5-stars out of 18 books, which is really unfortunate. I had a lot of 3 stars, a lot of kind of middle of the road of like, this was fine, but it wasn't the best. But the books that I loved that were 5 stars were like 10 out of 5 stars. Like, they were incredible and they were so good that it made me feel like I didn't have a dud of a reading month, because the books that were good were so good. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. How did your March reading go? Did you find any new favorites this month? I would love to hear which book was your favorite that you read in March. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.